When we think about grief and loss, there's a combination of things that affect us, and we may experience grief. And this can be from biological grief, the loss of a person, or an animal, a pet. Something may be behavioral or it can be psychological. So it's different things that affect us in different ways, and it depends on how someone looks at something and values it in how they respond to that loss and have that grieving response. Psychologically, people may be angry, go through depression, may have denial. Biologically, someone may have, they can't sleep, they cry, they have weight loss, they become depressed. Um, Also, too, sometimes people may become less social, um, may even have a change in how they react to others. Their personality may change. Um, and then again, we have that mourning period that comes along with grief, where we start trying to go through the motions and realization of the loss. Bereavement is also how we respond to um, losses such as death, and also to grieving is a part of that process that everyone must go through. And when we think about grief, everyone grieves in their own time. There's no certain timetable, such as you should reach this stage of the grieving process by, this week or in this many months. Everyone grieves in their own time, and everyone grieves differently. We also have some other things that affect how we grieve and mourn, and that can be either our spiritual or religious beliefs and practices, and also through our cultures. We all react differently. We look at losses and grieving process and deaths. One of the things as a nurse is that you have to have your own understanding of how you relate to and respond and react to death and grieving, because this is something that you will be experiencing as a nurse. And many times students will say, no one prepared me for this. And no one can actually prepare you how you're going to feel or you're going to react, but we can let you know what is normal and prepare you for situations that can arise. Um, a couple of types of losses that we have are known as actual losses, and these are usually things that are pretty much things that are going to happen, such as maturational loss, and this is usually losses that are from just normal life, happenings throughout our growth and our development, such as, someone going off to college and is leaving, or someone leaving their college campus to go on and start their career, and they leave their friends behind, and then that is a loss. Another one can be a situational loss, where something unexpected happens, such as someone loses a job, and that would be a situational loss. Perceived losses are usually individualized by that person experienced the loss, and no one else can understand that loss. So let's say you may have an item that maybe your grandmother gave you, and it wasn't anything special, but it was special to you. And if you lost that, you may have a reaction that some other people were like, well, gosh, it was just a ribbon, but maybe it was a ribbon that your grandmother used to tie her hair back with, and that you have that, or a ribbon that was on a bouquet of flowers that really meant something to you. So no one else can understand that loss. It's less obvious to them than it is to you. Grief is a normal process, and it is just an array of emotions that people go through. And it's something that no one else can explain to you how you're going to specifically feel, because everyone is going to experience that grief differently. It may be very strong, or it may be complicated where someone just can't get over an issue. Um, an example would be maybe a son and a father who were on the outs, had an argument, and they never saw each other again. And by the time the son realizes maybe he wants to go speak to his father passes away. And that could be what we know as complicated grief, because they never got to close the book on that chapter, and the father's no longer there. So that could be and and uh, and an actual thought process for that grief. We also have other types of grieving, and one of those is normal, uncomplicated grief. And this is just a normal reaction that people have. It's very emotional, psychological, physical, behavioral, spiritually. People have different responses. It depends on the type of how the death happened, can also change the way someone can grieve. However, the individual becomes resilient though and overcomes that grief, and so that's why it's normal and uncomplicated. Anticipatory grief is something that's a loss or the experience of loss before the event actually happens. So maybe someone's predicted um, uh, to pass away, or maybe has Alzheimer's, and they know that their memory is going to go and they're not going to remember them. And so they already anticipate that. Another type of grieving could be a mother grieving the loss of her daughter because she's about to get married and move away. And so she's anticipating that day is coming. So those are some examples there. Your disenfranchised grief, which is ambiguous, this is when someone can't share something very openly. It seems to have a lesser significance. So maybe someone um, has to cut their grieving short because of something happening. So they never really got to really experience and evaluate that grieving. So maybe someone that you had a relationship years ago for several years, you've broken off, and you find out later on in life that they just passed away and you hadn't seen them for a long time. So that could be an example of that one. Complicated grieving is when it's prolonged and someone's having a hard time moving forward, moving on. They just can't get over it. And so it can be also known as chronic or delayed. They become numb, bitter, and they've just never able to get over that grieving process. I did want to go back and just remind you that with situational losses, I also wanted to make sure that someone knew, besides the event, someone losing work, but it could also be an accident and maybe someone loses a limb. That would be a situational loss as well. I'll pause on each slide of the case study so that you can go through it and look at it and review it. Okay, here's a quick quiz. See if you can answer it without looking at the question at the bottom. There are different theorists who are out there, and one of the most famous and one of the ones that we see a lot of people moving towards is Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross is very influential. You'll hear about her. But many different theorists are out there that people follow. I tend to like Kubler-Ross and looking at the stages that individuals go through in the grieving process, such as denial, the anger, the bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. So please go through and look at that and look at the stages and what they mean while you're studying. Here's some organizations that deal with end-of-life care. So please take a moment to look over those. By federal law, the transplant coordinator usually meets with families, and they actually are the ones who request organ and tissue donation. So that would not be you as a hospital nurse. So by law, it would have to be the transplant coordinator. So sometimes individual students don't understand who does that, and sometimes they're worried they may be put in that position. A lot of times, what we see is the grieving process can sometimes be reopened as a reaction to maybe the anniversary of an event. Um, it is important for nurses to openly acknowledge the renewal of feelings of grief, and this also helps to facilitate the normal mourning process, whether it's for the patient or for the nurse themselves or for the staff as a whole. So we want to make sure that we're able to acknowledge our feelings of grief. And it's okay for nurses to grieve their patients. There's some patients that you'll become very close to, and it's very difficult when you lose that patient. And so, yeah, it's okay to cry. It's okay to be with the family and let the family know how much you respected or remembered that their loved one, what they meant to everyone, and that let them know that y'all are grieving too. When we look at factors that can influence loss and grief, one of those is human development. And we may see regression, um, even such as a toddler who may regress back and maybe start having accidents, even though they've been potty trained for a while, or start sucking a thumb. We may see preschoolers. Um, they question whether or not death is permanent, so they're very curious. You may see a preschooler who may have had let's say, goldfish, and they keep holding the goldfish and examining it after it has died, and so they may keep looking at it or want to go back and look at it again. However, that same in the same example, you may have a school age child who is trying to understand um, the death and burials. So they're very interested in burials and funerals. So they may want to put that fish in a box and have um, a uh, a funeral for that goldfish. Um, by the time by the time we're 9 to 11 years old, we start to understand death and realize that it is now inevitable and irreversible, that it does happen. One of the groups that has the hardest with coping with death would be your adolescents. They have a very hard time. They're very emotional, even though they have a mature understanding of death, but that is our group that has the hardest with coping with death. Also, the closer someone is to another person, the harder it is for them to move forward after the death, and they find it very difficult. Support groups are very, very important for these individuals. Sometimes the nature of the loss, if it is unexpected or tragic, those are definitely much harder than death that is expected. Coping strategies, everyone copes differently. Having a good coping skills is going to be very, very important. And we start to understand a little bit more about life and death and situations. So we do start to rely on those good coping measures um, and look for the healthy ones instead of the unhealthy. Socioeconomic status can also affect, burials. It may be hard for someone to go through a grieving process if they're trying to work and they've lost their spouse and they're trying to trying to go through the grieving process while trying to work a full-time job and take care of a family, or maybe they can't replace something. Maybe it was a loss of a home to a fire, and their they have limited finances to be able to find a home, or if they destroy a car in an accident and trying to get the money to replace the car. Um, Culture and ethnicity. We have different cultures. I'll give you a couple examples of some of the cultures that we see, but it depends on how they react to the body, to the burial, to the funeral. You have some, such as the Muslim faith. The females take care of the body after death and prepare it for the burial. Orthodox Jews, you'll notice those families will stay with the body until the burial the next day. You may have some areas and ethnic groups or cultural areas that may believe more in maybe a burial versus someone going and having a cremation. Some believe in mausoleums, others believe in burials. Some people may want to scatter the ashes. Some cultures believe in turning the body facing the sunset. And so there's different cultures that you'll see. The best thing to do with that is, as a nurse, is to always ask the family what they prefer and what is their culture and their belief around the grieving and death rituals. So as I said before, you should always discuss the wishes, their wishes with their healthcare provider. If they want to have notice a DNR, so always ask the patient, have they spoken to the healthcare provider if they say that they do not want to be resuscitated? So that would be the first step, and then we would move onward with the paperwork and getting the correct people in to fill out the papers. Also, too, it's important that we are honest with our patients about the dying process. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable for us and not something that we like to talk about, but it's important for the patient to talk. So allow them to talk, sit with them and sometimes they don't want an answer. They just want to talk about what they're going through and what they're experiencing at that time. The other thing, too, is letting the family come in and talk and share their experiences as well. So as we can see, grief means many different things. And so, again, everyone is different in how they grieve. They have different influences, support systems, relationships, again, the nature. And so all of those things come into account and gives a more of a different individualized meaning for that patient about the loss, or for that family about the loss of their loved one. Here's some examples of some nursing diagnoses that you may see when we're dealing with our patients and with loss and grief. And so just kind of look those over and just have a basic understanding of what those are, because you may see those when you work in the hospital or doing your care plans. One of the main things that we, with planning, that I always think about is discussing the wishes for the end-of-life care for that patient, what it is that they want, and or do we move on to palliative care? And lots of times we just deal with the most physical and psychological needs at that point. We want to make them comfortable. Sorry. We also will, here in a few minutes, discuss the difference between hospice and palliative care. So when we think about death, death is imminent. And so when it is imminent, we want to provide only the essential care, which is known as palliative care. And this is to help to enhance the patient's quality of life. You want to include the family on the decision, especially for children, and find out what their wishes are along with the family. When it comes to hospice, usually patients go to hospice when they have less than 6 months. We will be having a guest speaker from hospice coming in to speak to us in class, so we won't really have a whole lot of lecture time. But this is hospice helps to manage their pain and give them a lot of comfort, and wants to have their patients there to have the best quality of life. So I think you're really going to enjoy our guest speaker when she comes in. One of the best things that we could do, as I said before, is to listen and build that rapport with your patient and make sure that we are asking those open-ended questions so they can really tell us what it is that they want and what they need. Psychologically, we're going to be there. We may just need to hold a hand or just to sit with the patient. We're also going to manage any of their symptoms they may be having, such as pain. We're going to promote their dignity and their self-esteem. And we want to make them very comfortable. We want a peaceful environment, not a lot of lights, not a lot of beeps and sounds. One of the things that I most remember about my first patient who had passed away, I was working at ICU in Alabama, and was the Cheyne-Stokes respirations. And I remember coming in one night and hearing my patient breathe differently. And one of the nurses said, "That's the breath of death." And I said, "What is that?" And it was the Cheyne-Stokes respirations. And they're usually expected the last days of life. And this is when the patient will have periods of apnea, and it will alternate with deep and rapid breaths. And I'll never forget that. And one of the rituals that they had is when we talked about cultures and death and dying, is in the ICU when a patient would pass away, they would open up the window, not very much, just a crack, and that allowed for their spirit to leave. And that was just something that they practiced there. Not all ICU units do that, I'm sure, and most of them don't have windows to the outside, but where I was, we did. And that was just a practice that they had, so you may find something where you work. Towards the end of life, a few things that I think about is wanting to promote spiritual health, comfort, and hope, and making sure that they know someone is there with them. We also want to support the family, sit with them. If they need to leave, then we'll let them know that we will be there for their family member. Sometimes just sitting with your patient, as I said, you want to listen and just let them talk. Physically, we will see some modeling in the skin as a patient is moving through the death process. Some of the psychological responses to death, maybe sometimes a patient may start to have some anxiety because they feel like they have unfinished business, that they weren't able to do some things that they wanted to do, or maybe talk to individual family members that they wanted to talk to. One of the things that we need to do is give our families and the parents of a child time to decide what they want to do. Give them time with the body. There's never a time limit. Let them sit there, be with them. If they want to dress them or wipe them down, we can do that. Parents of a child, an infant, they may want to sit and rock with the infant, and you want to give them as much time as they need. So you want to give them space and time and privacy. The other thing that we do is post-mortem care. So one of the things we'll do is we will position the patient with the head of the bed raised, and this prevents the discoloration of the face. So when the family comes in, there won't be that discoloration. We'll also make sure that the dentures, if they wear dentures, are still in, or we put them in, and this helps to maintain their facial shape. And then we'll cover the body with a sheet up to about the shoulders, and we'll wipe in case there's any blood or anything like that. We'll remove that and make sure the body looks clean, and they when they come in to see the family member who's passed away. Always give respect for the body of the deceased. Again, you want to make sure that you sit back and talk to someone after each patient has passed away, and or sit with the fellow nursing staff that worked with that patient, especially if you're having a hard time with it. It's just never easy. And it's not something that everyone likes to experience, or will ever maybe sometimes get to experience. It depends on where you work. But it is part of that nursing care. And when you get that opportunity while you're a student, I think it would be an excellent time for you to get as much experience as you can. When you're looking through this chapter in your textbooks, please go through the different charts and tables. They have some really, really good information and some examples in your textbook. Look at your NCO book. Please look at the links. And as I said, we will have a guest speaker coming in. And I'm going to let you finish looking at the case study on the slides, and that will end this presentation.